Welcome to our online panel discussion. This panel discussion is a part of the project Youth with Migration Background, Empowering Political Engagement, Participation, and Fostering Social Inclusion. And this initiative is run by the Turkish Research Foundation and the PLUS Institute. With this project, we aim to empower young immigrants through comprehensive theoretical and practical training, enhancing their political awareness and active participation in the public sphere. It's also worth to mention that this project is supported by the Turkish National Agency and funded by the European Union. And today marks the first in a series of 10 online panels. We are honored to have two distinguished speakers with us. Our first speaker is Natalia Bănulescu-Bogdan. She is the Deputy Director of Migration Policy Institute's International Program. And our second speaker is Dr. İdil Lika. He is an assistant professor in the Political Science Department at İbn Haldun University in Istanbul. In today's panel, each speaker will present approximately for 15 to 20 minutes. And it's also worth to note that this panel is, we are live streaming this panel, and you can watch it on YouTube. And at the end of this panel, we will save this panel in our website, designed for this project, so other young immigrants can benefit from this presentation in the future. So let's start with our first speaker, Natalia Bănulescu-Bogdan. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ayhan. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. I want to start a little bit by talking about why combating misinformation around migration is so critical, and then go into some of the tools that we have to combat it. So obviously, we know that there is a large amount of distorted and misleading information on migration, which contributes to a lot of mistrust between groups, discrimination, outright xenophobia. It really sows a lot of the societal divisions that we're seeing in a very highly polarized time. And migration is one of those issues that is particularly susceptible to misinformation. It's a very complex topic. Even top experts can reasonably debate the interpretation of facts and even quote unquote hard data. Second, it's a highly emotional issue, so it's very tied to people's sense of identity and belonging in the world, which kind of pushes it outside the realm of facts in a lot of ways. And third, migrants and people of migrant descent are often underrepresented in media. And so a lot of the information that is disseminated about different groups doesn't come from the first person and is not easily sort of countered by information that is coming directly from these groups. And I think some of our natural impulses for how to correct the spread of misinformation and correct some of these imbalances might lead us in the wrong directions sometimes. So a lot of the interventions we see around combating xenophobia, for instance, are focused on promoting positive narratives to combat the negative ones or introduce counter narratives. And one of the issues was this it can backfire sometimes to focus your efforts on proving people wrong. And I'll go into why this is an issue in a minute. And so there's a desire to get more to the root of the problem. So interrupting fake news or misinformation or harmful information from gaining ground and gaining traction in the first place, because it's so difficult to actually intervene once it is alive and spreading already in communities. So there's sort of two general buckets of responses in terms of how we deal with misinformation. There's the supply side and there's the demand side. So I'll go over the supply side very quickly, and then we can spend a little bit more time on the demand side. So on the supply side, there are a lot of efforts to regulate online content. In the EU, in the US, there are many efforts to flag disinformation, use fact checkers to monitor news sites and social media platforms. This is not always effective. Fact checking also gives visibility to false information. We talk a lot about the problem of debunking myths, which often centers around highlighting the problematic or false information in sort of bold print that is actually very easy to remember and catchy and visually appealing before, sort of in small, dense print describing why it's problematic or false. So the very act of repeating problematic information or drawing attention to it can actually make it stick more in people's minds. So that's one of the issue. Trying to regulate the platforms itself, as the EU has done with the Digital Services Act, or the EU-led Code of Practice on Disinformation, basically trying to hold social media companies accountable for their role in sort of hosting some of the fake news, and also trying to use financial incentives for purveyors of disinformation. So, you see things like an unverified content label on TikTok or fact check labels on Facebook, but it's really difficult to measure the actual impact of these tools. So even if you can get data on how many people have been exposed to these labels or these corrections, it doesn't mean that we know that people were convinced by them or that they then turned to a more legitimate source of information. And so this sort of supply side can never be the only solution. Just the sheer volume of information and the proliferation of information in the world right now and all the different platforms, there's just a lot of information being spread outside the purview of fact checkers. And even if you remove it from one platform, you have no guarantee that it isn't popping up somewhere else. You have no guarantee that the people who have seen this have actually changed their views on the topic because it's been flagged or corrected. And so I think quite rightly, there's a sort of renewed focus on the demand side or the user side. So trying to instead shape how people absorb information, give people the tools to make better decisions when they're evaluating the information in front of them and deciding what's credible, getting people to be more discerning consumers and disseminators of information in a sense. And so you have all of these media literacy programs targeting youth. So, trying to start these habits and these tools, cementing these tools of discernment and evaluation from, the school ages, and also interventions targeting migrant youth in particular, which are very interesting and also kind of seek to not only promote digital tools, but also promote some resilience when migrants do come into contact with harmful information. And so the idea is that when we increase media literacy levels, we can influence the reach and the appeal of disinformation. But I think one of the issues I want to point out is there's a power asymmetry here. So it's very important to start to build these skills with young people, but they are not the owners of the news programs or the social media sites. And so we have to contend with the fact that, you know, we're working on generational changes, but as long as migrant youth and migrants in general are so underrepresented in these information channels where people get most of their news, and as long as we're not sort of, you know, targeting the main people in power, there's a sort of limit in the short term to the reach of these interventions. But there's certainly some interesting things, like, you know, UN campaigns to get people to pause before they share. So just taking that moment to think, is this information credible? You know, is just not blindly clicking and, you know, sharing with all of your followers, but sort of taking that extra step to reflect. And I think there was some interesting studies during COVID where there were interventions to simply ask people to consider whether a headline might be true or false before they shared it. And there was some data suggesting that just this very small, simple intervention actually decreased the spread of misinformation around COVID. And so you have this set of interventions focused on empowering users to recognize and flag disinformation. But another issue I want to point out is these interventions assume there is a clear and bright division between facts and falsehoods, facts and disinformation. And in fact, there are a lot of gray areas between facts and outright falsehoods. So obviously on the extreme side of the spectrum, there's information that has been fabricated to deliberately mislead, often with the express goal of actually increasing societal divisions and promoting prejudicial positions against immigrants and minorities. But there's also this big fuzzy gray area in the middle. So you have situations where people don't mean to spread disinformation, but they're sharing things without thinking about it. Situations where you have accurate figures and data, but they're used without context or out of context. Situations where headlines or images aren't connected to the content of the article, or where people are citing things in good faith, but don't maybe have the resources to actually fact check and verify all of the claims that are being made. And so sometimes we think about conspiracy theories and disinformation as sort of on the fringes of the internet, but this middle category, this gray area, can actually be found in mainstream media, and it's not always malicious. So I think, especially right now, when we're seeing even the most established news outlets facing massive personnel and budget cuts, you know, a lot of times, you know, news is happening quickly. There's a lot of pressure to compete with other sources of news, and there isn't the time or resources to sort of robustly check sources. And so I think the more we see the misinformation wedged into these gray areas, the harder it is to combat, because it takes quite a big level of sophistication and discernment to evaluate information like this on its merits. And so just to finish up, I want to suggest a third area that we need to consider. So we talked about supply side solutions, demand side solutions, but we shouldn't only be concerned with the hard tools that people have to improve their media literacy, but we also need to think about incentives they have to do so. So I think we really need to consider the social psychology of how people seek out information and why people decide that one thing is credible over another. And I would offer that how people decide what to believe on migration is very much linked to their identity and their social identity circles. And so facts, as we know, do not exist in a vacuum, but this is even more true, I think, with migration, when what often matters and what often resonates with people is how new information aligns with people's pre-existing beliefs and fears. And so, especially when people are absorbing information that comes through social media, through WhatsApp, through Signal, through their social identity circles, this is how people filter the massive amount of information they're being fed on migration, which is often contradictory. And so when you don't know what to believe, it's actually quite reasonable to trust more the information that's coming from your trusted circles of identity. So if somebody you trust shares information or gives you a frame with which to interpret things happening around you, this is actually a very valid way of creating meaning. And it means that this competes with the more academic style kind of media literacy that we are trying to teach people. And I think we need to understand that on one hand, we want people to be seeking accuracy when they consume information, but often they're seeking belonging and sort of accepting information that comes from people they trust is a way of signaling this belonging. And that makes our interventions more complicated. There's also the issue that I alluded to at the beginning when we're talking about fact checking, that people don't want their views challenged. There's a strong confirmation bias that we have when all of us are consuming information. This applies to everybody, which means that we seek out information that confirms what we already believe because that's what feels good to consume. This is just basic human psychology. And so information that challenges us, or worse, calls us wrong, or calls people, morally compromised for having skeptical views about immigration, that doesn't feel good. And that makes it more likely that it will be discredited. So this is all to explain why simply labeling something as false is actually not enough to convince people exposed to this information to stop believing it or sharing it, particularly when the broader narrative or claims being made resonate with people's pre-existing convictions and concerns. And so just to finish up, I would say that we need to consider not just hard tools, but also the incentives, the human psychology, and the power dynamics around how information is consumed. Thanks.
Thank you, Natalia, for your valuable comments. And when I listened to you, I also talked about the need of confirmation of your own ideas. I think this is one of the most important issues regarding to hate towards immigrants. There are a lot of information on the social media, and at the end of the day, you choose the ones that confirms your own ideas. And there are also what I want to ask to Dr. İdil Lika. There are also political entrepreneurs who read this and then who try to turn this hate towards the immigrants to political participation and to votes. I think this is one of the main issue in today populism issue in the whole world, also in Western countries. So I want to ask a question to Dr. İdil Lika and want to that he enlightens us about this issue, how this hate towards immigrants is coincident with the right-wing populism in the Western Europe and other Western countries.
Thanks, Ayhan. Thanks first for having me here, and greetings also to my colleague Natalia, who made a fascinating, thought-provoking speech. Now, your question is very much to the point, and I was going just to intervene on that. that yes, we have to do with all the problems that my colleague Natalia already mentioned. Especially, I want to pick up on the last point on this issue of cognitive dissonance, right? Which is very important when we discuss the issue of the role of media literacy in promoting social inclusion among the immigrants. But we shouldn't forget something very basic, that we are dealing in an environment that, especially in the last 10 years, is an environment of extreme polarization, societal polarization, especially in European and North American countries, the United States of America. And what I want to point out here is that immigrants and refugees, for sure, are the primary targets of all the xenophobic and all the racist rhetoric coming, especially from populist politicians. That's very important to point out. But what I think is most important here is that there has been a blurring of distinctions between the right-wing and left-wing populists. So both of these are using the same language, and it's impossible to sometimes to differentiate who is right-wing and who is left-wing. You may find a politician who is nominally the leader of a leftist party, say the Socialist or Social Democratic Party, but who on issues, on cultural issues, be it immigration, refugees, abortion, this issue which are really sensitive, very much cling to the right, even to the far right. I mean, I'm going to give you an example of a topic which I'm currently studying, and I published something on that. This issue of the recent assassination attempt on Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico, which has been dealing in European countries for the past 2 weeks. I mean, Fico, who is a former Communist Party member, is nominally the leader of a leftist party, Social Democratic Party, Smer, Social Democracy, that's the name of his party. But on attitudes towards immigrants and on refugees, he has gone so far on the right that it's impossible to distinguish between him and a far-right politician. And you can hear very, very frequently, I mean, for example, because Fico was recently re-elected as prime minister, I mean, high-level officials from his parties, for example, I remember that they characterized the Romas as animals in zoo, right, which was extreme speech. And Fico actually went behind these politicians from his party by saying that the majority or the absolute majority of the Slovak people actually thinks like that unfortunately Romas are like animals in a zoo. So you see that this speech is really problematic, and especially when coming from leftist politicians, which normally shouldn't be like that, you said the opposite, shows to us the blurring of distinctions. So this is the first point. The second point is that, which Natalia also mentioned, we also need to think about on how attitudes towards immigrants, right, fit into the beliefs and the conception that the citizens of the countries that we are dealing with have towards this. So this is also very important. So it's not only an issue of cognitive dissonance, it's also an issue on how citizens of host countries, let's call it like this, or host societies, think towards the refugees and immigrants. And especially, do they see them as a threat, or do they see them as a reinforcement to the nation-building models of the countries in which they are residing? Right? This is very important to point out, because while you have all these xenophobic and racist attitudes towards immigrants in most of the European countries, for sure, populism is to blame for that. Immoral politicians are to blame for that. Nobody doubts about that. But we also need to think that European countries, historically, right, especially, I mean, I'm going to single out the period before the Second World War, but even after the Second World War, have seen immigrants and refugees as a threat towards the nation-building models that are being built in their countries, right? But if you take, for example, the example of Turkey, or Turkey, to use the new official name of the country, and the attitudes towards Syrian immigrants, right? Don't forget that Turkey is the largest recipient, by far, the largest recipient of Syrian refugees in the world, right? And not only of Syrian refugees, in the last 5 years, we have had this whole bunch, right, of refugees coming from mostly Muslim countries, Central Asia, Middle Eastern countries, and Africa, right? Now, what has been the attitude of the Turkish state and Turkish society towards that? And let's put this in the issue of how, or what's the possibility that media literacy programs in Turkey can be successful in socially including these immigrants. Now, what's important here to point out that officially speaking, right, the Turkish government, but also the Turkish society to a very large extent, I'm not going to count the last 2 or 3 years, when because of presidential and other elections we have had kind of a drift in attitudes, but largely speaking, right, the immigrants and the refugees have been welcomed in Turkish society. And that's very important to point out. And the main reason why is that these immigrants and refugees, the vast majority of which does not speak Turkish, but is Muslim, nominally speaking, right, are seen, and I'm going to quote from academic literature that I'm now studying, are seen as a reinforcement for the new nation-building policy that the Turkish Republic is pursuing. I mean, this move away from the assimilationist anti-ethnic model that Turkey had since the beginning of the Republic to a much more multi-ethnic model that the different AK Party governments has been pursuing since 2002. So in a sense, this group of immigrants, which is very large, millions, only 4 to 5 millions are Syrians of them, right, are perceived in a sense as natural allies or as reinforcement in this official drive to shift the Turkish Republic from being assimilationist to being very much multi-ethnic, multicultural. So this is very important to point out. If you go to another country, Russian Federation, which is the second largest recipient of immigrants in the world by far, right? In the same way, the vast majority of the people which are migrating to Russia are Russian speakers from former Soviet countries, right? From former Soviet countries. And in a sense, these immigrants, being Russian speakers, some of them being even ethnic Russians, are also seen as natural allies and reinforcement for a shift that has been taking place in Russia since the dissolution of Soviet Union, from a multicultural, multi-ethnic model towards an assimilationist model, the complete opposite of what is occurring in Turkey. So you see that in these two cases, there is a reinforcement between the immigrants which are being received and what the government is officially trying to do with their nation building models. So I would say that the probability of media literacy programs in these two countries, much more in Turkey, to succeed in the social inclusion of immigrants is much higher than in European countries. Of course, for Russia, I'm talking before its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, because now there is a much more ethnic nationalist mood in all of Russia. I mean, before 2022, while in Turkey, it's still going on. But if you go to the European countries, which I would say is still a very large mood of nation-building model being conceived as assimilationist, anti-ethnic, meaning that, yes, you accept people from different ethnic background, but these are not allowed to express their ethnic and religious distinctiveness. They are supposed, or they are expected to assimilate to a state level, right, officially sanctioned identity, be it in the ethnic sense and be it in the religious sense, which is mostly secular, right? So that's why immigration is perceived as a threat in these countries, because it does not align with the official nation building model. And that is why it also opened the door to these issues that Natalia also mentioned of cognitive dissonance. Because citizens in European countries, in their mind, they also have this model. And now when you have people from completely different ethnic and religious background, which do not wish to assimilate to that official sanctioned model, right, you have problems. Right? You have problems. Yes, you have all this media literacy program, that's true. But again, the possibility of them become successful, right, is very doubtful in such an environment. When you have polarization, you have populist politicians, you have issues of cognitive dissonance, and you have also issues of divergence from the official policies that the government in these countries are trying to pursue. So I think that these examples that I brought forward of Turkey and how immigrants are perceived, and in the example of Russia before the invasion of Ukraine, on how immigrants were reinforcing the anti-ethnic and assimilationist nation model that the Putin regime has been pursuing, and in the case of Europe, how these are actually diverging from the pre-held conception of the people and from the official policy of the governments, actually provides food for thought on how and when, in some cases, media literacy programs can have more possibility for becoming successful, and in other contexts can have less possibility for becoming successful. And with that, I'm going to stop here. And if we have any question, we might just pick up from there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ilika. And I want to give Natalia a couple of minutes if she wants to add another comments. The floor is for you, Natalia. Do you want to add something to comments of Ilika as your last words?
Thank you. No, I think that was fascinating, and I think it's very important to point out the prevalence of this negative discourse on migration. As you say, there has been an absolute drift to the right in most mainstream parties in Europe, where, you know, in the scramble to not lose some of their voters who have been gravitating toward the far right parties, we've seen this mimicry of some of the language and scapegoating, because of course it's very easy to blame the sort of amorphous societal problems that might accrue from things like globalization and, you know, enlargement of the EU and the economic downturn and COVID, you know, that can't be easily explained in a satisfying way, and instead to concentrate them on the very visible newcomer populations. It's a very easy trick to use. It's effective because you know, blaming populations that have the least power and voice in society can go unchecked and unquestioned. And of course, populations that are living with economic and sort of social insecurity want something to grasp onto, a sort of thing to blame for some of the things that trouble them in their societies that they don't have an easy solution to. I think the thing to watch out for is if there can be a sort of reversal of this trend when people realize that, okay, we've elected these far-right politicians and conservatives or centrist parties with increasingly anti-immigration views, and actually they didn't solve any of the problems that they said that they alone were equipped to solve. So maybe there'll be a sort of backlash against this, but I think right now we're absolutely on the ascent of the curve in terms of this type of rhetoric and these powers gaining a lot of power in society, which I think makes all the things we're talking about that much more important to address, but also that much more difficult. And so, you know, I think we, you know, have to keep in mind what tools are really realistic in which settings. And also, as Dr. Lika mentioned, the kind of underlying context also that these interventions are falling into or being sort of dropped into, where if there isn't an overarching frame for the integration of migrants, supporting diversity in multi-ethnic societies, accommodating some of these differences as becoming part of the new fabric of society, then, you know, without that sort of backbone of support, it makes it just all the more difficult for these one-off interventions to succeed. So we kind of have to focus on both the big picture as well as these smaller, more targeted interventions at once.
Thank you, Natalia. And Dr. Lika, do you want to add your last comments?
Not any specific one. I'm just an apology. I was not as specific as my colleague on the issue of media literacy. I'm more focused on my area of expertise, which was on comparative politics of different nation building models, and how can this impact the issue of the role of media literacy on the social inclusion of immigrants. But I want to thank my colleague. I learned a lot from her, and I think it was a good synergy of connecting her expertise on the issue of media literacy, and also what I brought from the comparative politics literature, especially on the issue that I saw that she agrees with on the blurring of the distinctions that exist between left-wing and right-wing populism. Right-wing populism, we already know that, but for leftist politicians nominally to drift so much to the right, even to the far right, I would say that's totally exceptional, I would say, and not good at all for the prospects of social inclusion of immigrants in Europe. We now have European parliamentary election just this Sunday on the 9th of June. A very charged atmosphere, right, that's going to play a very big role. And as I told to you, we are just coming from an assassination attempt on the prime minister of a NATO and EU member state, Slovakia's Robert Fico, right, who is normally also known to be very pro-Russian in his views. So, and what I actually thought that all of this is symptomatic of the extreme polarization of European societies. And I think that this assassination attempt is also going to add more fuel to this very divided social fabric. And I hope not, but maybe we're going to see the ramification of that in the elections that we are going to have this Sunday. And perhaps it will going to be a much more difficult social environment than for immigrants in Europe after that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this was a good panel to understand the underlying reason to the problem of hate towards immigrants. So we looked at it from a media perspective and also from a political scientist perspective. That's why I want to thank you again to Natalia Bănăsescu-Bogdan from Migration Policy Institute and to Dr. İdil Lika from Ibn Haldun University. Thank you very much and have a nice day.
Thank you, Ayhan. It was really excellent, and we hope to see you together again in other opportunities.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.